blood. That was what I still felt on my hands when I crossed the border of Egypt for the last time as a prince. Egyptian blood that would seal the fate of 2 nations and unleash the most devastating wrath the world had ever witnessed. I am Moses, and what you are about to see forever changed the course of human history. When the invisible God of the slaves broke the chains of a forgotten people and humiliated the most powerful empire on earth. The blood was still fresh on my hands when I crossed the border of Egypt. Egyptian blood. The blood of that overseer who was beating my Hebrew brother almost to death. A single blow had been enough to silence him forever, but not to silence the echo of that moment that now haunted me across the relentless desert. Every grain of sand the wind threw in my face seemed to whisper, murderer, fugitive, failure. Pharaoh wanted me dead. The man who had known me since childhood, who had seen me grow up in the corridors of his palace, had now put a price on my head. 40 years of privilege unraveled in a single moment of fury, and there I was. The Prince of Egypt turned into a thirsty nomad, carrying only the clothes on my back and the crushing weight of a purpose I did not yet understand. The memories haunted me as I walked. I saw myself again as that baby in the reed basket, floating on the waters of the Nile, while my real mother watched from afar, her heart broken by the need to abandon me to save me. The Pharaoh's decree echoed in my mind. Every Hebrew boy must die. But someone, had prevented me from becoming just another victim of that systematic genocide. The Pharaoh's daughter, that compassionate princess who found me crying among the reeds and decided to defy her own father by adopting me. She gave me a name, an identity, a future. Moses, drawn out of the waters. I never imagined how prophetic that name would be, nor how many waters I would still cross, divide, and transform. I grew up as Egyptian royalty, learned their languages, their customs, their wisdom. I had access to the best tutors, the vastest libraries, the most guarded state secrets. But I always knew I was different. I always felt the call of the blood running through my veins. While other princes worried about banquets and hunts, I watched from the palace windows as the Hebrew slaves carried stones under the scorching sun. I saw their bodies bent by forced labor, their backs marked by the whip, their eyes without hope. And something inside me rebelled. How many times did I try to intervene discreetly? How many times did I use my position to ease the suffering of a few? But they were drops of water in an ocean of oppression. The system was immense, relentless, fueled by the greed of a nation that had built its glory on the bones of the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The first time I visited the construction sites, I felt something I could not name. It was as if a silent voice whispered in my ear, "These are your brothers." Not palace brothers, but brothers of blood, of lineage, of destiny. There I was, dressed in fine linen and gold jewelry, while they barely had rags to cover their wounded bodies. And then came that day, the day that changed everything. I saw the Egyptian overseer brutally whipping an elderly Hebrew who had stumbled with his load. The man cried out for mercy, but the whip kept falling. I looked around. No one else witnessed the scene. That was when fury took hold of me. A fury that came from a place deeper than my Egyptian upbringing, older than my life in the palace. It was as if 400 years of oppression exploded through my fists. The blow was precise, deadly. The overseer collapsed like a sack of grain, and I stood there breathless, contemplating what I had done. I buried the body in the sand, but I could not bury the truth. I had crossed a line from which there was no return. I was no longer an Egyptian prince watching from afar. I was an Israelite who had shed blood for his people. The next day, when I tried to intervene in a fight between two Hebrews, the reply of one cut deeper than any blade. "Who made you prince and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" My secret had been discovered. There was no turning back. The forced exile in the desert was not just an escape. It was a stripping away. Each step took me further not only from Egypt but from the person I thought I was. The Prince Moses died in those sands. What survived was something new, still undefined, molded by the merciless sun and absolute solitude. 40 years of certainty dissolved in 40 days of journeying into the unknown. When I finally saw the tents of Midian on the horizon, I was no longer the man who had left Egypt. I was a refugee, a shepherd in training, someone who needed to learn to listen to the silence of the desert to perhaps one day hear the voice that would change not only my life, but the destiny of 2 entire nations. What I did not know was that my true journey was only beginning in the arid lands of Midian. 40 years, 4 whole decades shepherding sheep in the arid mountains of Midian had transformed the 40-year-old fugitive prince into an 80-year-old man marked by the desert. My hands, once soft from Egyptian luxury, were now calloused from the shepherd's staff. My face, bronzed by the relentless sun, carried wrinkles that told stories of solitude and reflection. Jethro, my father-in-law, had welcomed me as a son, and his daughter Zipporah gave me 2 sons who ran across the rocky fields like wild little goats. The simple life had pacified me. I woke before dawn, led the flock through the scarce pastures, returned at sunset. There was no more politics, conspiracies, or responsibilities weighing on my shoulders. It was just Moses, the shepherd. I liked to believe I had found my ultimate peace far from the turmoil of the civilized world. But the past never completely abandons us. In the silent nights of the desert, when the wind whispered among the rocks, I still heard the groans of the Hebrew slaves echoing through the decades. I saw their pleading faces, their bent bodies, their tears mixed with sweat under Egypt's scorching sun. And one question constantly tormented me. Where was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Why did he remain silent while his people suffered? That morning began like any other. I led Jethro's sheep to the slopes of Mount Horeb, following a trail I knew by heart. The sun was still low when I noticed something strange in the distance, a light dancing among the dry bushes. I thought it was just the reflection of the morning sun on the stones, but the brightness remained constant, pulsing, alive. I approached with curiosity. It was an ordinary bush, typical of that region, but it was completely engulfed in flames that did not consume it. The flames rose and fell in a hypnotic rhythm, yet each leaf remained intact. Each branch kept its original shape. It was impossible, defying every law of nature I knew. I stopped at a safe distance, fascinated and terrified at the same time. 40 years of life in the desert had taught me to respect the unexplainable, but this transcended any natural phenomenon I had ever witnessed. The fire produced no smoke, did not crackle like ordinary fire, and radiated a presence that made every fiber of my being tremble with instinctive reverence. Then the voice echoed from the midst of the flames. He called me by name. Twice I heard it resound deep within me, that it was I, Moses. It did not come from the heavens nor from the earth, but from the very center of the burning bush. When I heard my name repeated, I knew immediately it was not a human voice. There was an authority in it that made my soul tremble, a purity that exposed every sin, every failure, every moment of cowardice I carried. Instinctively I responded that I was there, that I presented myself before him, filled with fear and reverence. Then he warned me not to come closer, and commanded me to remove the sandals from my feet, for the place where I was standing was holy ground. I removed the sandals with trembling hands, each movement an instinctive reverence before the impossible. The ground beneath my bare feet radiated a holiness that pierced every fiber of my being. It was like standing in the presence of the very source of life, of the power that had spoken and brought worlds into existence. Then he revealed himself to me, saying he was the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. I immediately covered my face, not out of fear of death, but because I knew that no man could behold such glory and remain alive. The revelation that followed shattered me within. He was the God of my ancestors, and he had come down to deliver his people from Egyptian oppression. The cry of the children of Israel had reached him, and now, of all possible people, I would be his instrument of deliverance. My first reaction was pure terror, followed by absolute denial. Me, an 80-year-old fugitive who could barely speak fluently, a man who had failed as a leader when young and now lived as a simple shepherd. How could I return to Egypt and confront the most fearsome power on earth? I tried to argue, protest, find any excuse to free myself from that impossible mission. I spoke of my inability to speak well, of the fact that the Hebrew people themselves might not accept me after 40 years of absence. But each objection was answered with a promise, each fear confronted with a guarantee of divine power. He showed me signs that defied reason. My shepherd's staff turned into a serpent that made me recoil in panic, then returned to its original form when I grabbed it again. My hand became leprous like snow when I placed it on my chest, then was completely healed when I repeated the gesture. They were demonstrations of a power I had never imagined existed. But the moment that changed everything was when he revealed his name.
I am who I am.
It was not just a name. It was a declaration of absolute existence, eternity, limitless power. It was the answer to all my questions about his apparent absence during centuries of suffering. He had never left. He had been there all along, waiting for the exact moment to act. The responsibility that fell on my shoulders at that instant was overwhelming. I was no longer just an anonymous shepherd in the desert of Midian. I was the chosen one to return to the most powerful empire on earth and demand the freedom of 600,000 enslaved people. I was the spokesman of the invisible God before pharaohs who considered themselves divine. When the divine presence withdrew and the fire died out, I remained there for hours trying to process what had happened. My simple and peaceful life had ended. Ahead lay a journey that would test every fiber of my faith, that would confront me with painful memories and lost friendships. I returned home knowing that soon I would stand face to face with people I had abandoned 4 decades ago. I would have to look into the eyes of those I once called brothers, and who now considered me a mortal enemy. But something had changed irrevocably within me on that mountain. The shepherd Moses was dead. Now among the sheep walked the deliverer of Israel, carrying a burden that only faith could make bearable. Returning to Egypt after 40 years of exile was like rising from the dead. Every familiar stone, every majestic column, every hieroglyph carved into the walls instantly transported me back to the days of my youth, when I ran through the palace corridors as a carefree prince. But now I walked as a foreigner in my own homeland, carrying a shepherd's staff and a mission that would challenge the most powerful empire of the known world. Aaron awaited me on the outskirts of the city, just as had been promised. My older brother, now 83 years old, still possessed the eloquence I had never had. His eyes filled with tears when he saw me approaching. I was no longer the young prince who had fled, but an elder marked by the desert, with hair and beard whitened by the relentless sun of Midian. Together we went first to the elders of the children of Israel. We found a broken people, bent by generations of slavery that had intensified drastically since my escape. Their backs were maps of scars left by Egyptian whips. Their eyes reflected a deep resignation that cut my soul. When Aaron proclaimed the words I had taught him and performed the signs before them, something extraordinary happened. The staff that turned into a serpent before their eyes drew exclamations of astonishment and reverence. My hand that became leprous and was then instantly healed made them fall to their knees. But when I poured water from the Nile onto the dry ground and it turned into blood, silence fell. They were unmistakable signs of divine power, and that suffering people immediately recognized the hand of the God of their fathers moving on their behalf. For the first time in centuries, the children of Israel bowed and worshipped. Tears rolled down faces prematurely aged by forced labor. Mothers held their children against their chests, whispering prayers of gratitude they thought they would never speak. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had not forgotten them. The promise made to the patriarchs would finally be fulfilled. But convincing my own people was only the first step. Ahead lay the true challenge, confronting the man who had once been my playmate, my foster brother, my confidant in the palace's secrets. The new pharaoh was not the same one who had raised me. That one had died decades ago. This was his descendant, likely a grandson, but he carried the same divine arrogance, the same absolute conviction that he was a god incarnate. The throne room remained exactly as I remembered. Gigantic columns supported a ceiling painted with scenes of the Egyptian gods, while scribes and courtiers moved in reverent silence. The massive golden throne, encrusted with precious stones that captured and reflected every ray of light, dominated the room with its intimidating magnificence. When I was announced, a murmur swept through the entire court. Moses, the fugitive prince, had returned. Some older courtiers recognized me immediately, their eyes widening in shock and disbelief. The young man who had fled as a criminal now returned as a prophetic-looking elder, wearing simple shepherd's clothes and carrying only a rustic staff. Pharaoh observed me for long moments before speaking. His eyes held a complex mix of curiosity, disdain, and something that could be interpreted as a shadow of lost affection. He knew the stories about me, had grown up hearing tales of the prince who had betrayed his own class to defend Hebrew slaves. But to see me there, decades later, must have been like beholding a ghost from the past. My request echoed through the hall like a distant thunder, to let the people of Israel go to worship their God in the desert for 3 days. Simple words, but they carried the weight of 400 years of captivity. They were not just words. They were a declaration of war against the entire economic and religious structure of Egypt. Pharaoh's response was predictable, yet still cutting. Who was this Lord of the Hebrews that he should obey his voice? The gods of Egypt had made his nation the most prosperous and powerful on earth. The Nile was their deity, Ra was his heavenly father, and he himself was the embodiment of Horus. Why should he bow before an invisible deity of an enslaved people? I demonstrated the signs I had been given, but the court magicians reproduced them with their occult arts. My staff turned into a serpent, but theirs did too. The difference was that my serpent devoured theirs, a dark foreshadowing of what was to come. But Pharaoh's heart hardened before what he had witnessed. His final words echoed like a sentence. He not only refused our request, but would intensify the oppression over the children of Israel. If they had time to think about worship, it meant they were not working hard enough. From that moment on, they would have to produce the same number of bricks but without being given straw. They would have to gather it themselves. I left the palace carrying not only rejection but the responsibility for the intensified suffering of my people. The Hebrews, who had initially welcomed me with hope, now blamed me for the worsening of their situation. Their groans multiplied. Their bodies were whipped with even more brutality, and all because of my failed intervention. That night, alone under the stars that shone indifferently over the Nile Valley, I cried out to the Almighty with an anguish that threatened to tear me apart. Why had he allowed the suffering of the people to increase? Why had Pharaoh's heart become even harder after witnessing his power? The answer I received completely changed my perspective on what was about to happen. That first display of power had not been rejected. It had only been the beginning. Pharaoh would come to know the name of the Lord through acts that would shake the very foundations of his civilization. Each refusal would harden his heart even more, preparing him for judgments that would reveal who truly ruled over the earth and the heavens. The confrontation was only beginning, and the sacred waters of the Nile would soon witness the first act of a war between gods that would forever change the course of human history. The next morning brought a devastating clarity about what was about to happen. There would be no more diplomatic negotiations or subtle demonstrations of power. The Almighty had declared war on the very foundations of Egyptian civilization, and I would be his unsheathed sword against the gods who had enslaved my people for 4 centuries. I went to the Nile at dawn, when Pharaoh performed his morning devotions to the sacred river. It was a ritual I had known since childhood, the divine descendant of Ra walking majestically to the waters that gave life to Egypt, offering incense and prayers to the god who supposedly controlled the annual floods. Seeing that man, who had grown up in the same corridors as I did, bowing before waters that would soon become an instrument of divine judgment, stirred in me a strange mix of compassion and unshakable determination. Aaron was at my side, carrying the staff that had become the symbol of the power we represented. The courtiers and priests accompanying Pharaoh watched us with a mix of curiosity and disdain as we approached. To them, we were just 2 elderly Hebrews disturbing a sacred ritual with our primitive superstitions. When I once again proclaimed the demand for freedom, Pharaoh's response was a scornful laugh that echoed along the riverbanks. His magicians positioned themselves strategically, ready for another display of their occult arts to refute our power. Egyptian pride was about to be shattered, though they did not yet know it. I raised the staff over the crystalline waters of the Nile under the first rays of the sun. For a moment, everything seemed suspended. Time, the breath of those present, even the morning breeze. Then, as if an invisible force had poured red ink from the very throne of heaven, the transformation began. The change was not gradual. It was instant, absolute, terrifying. The clear waters turned to red blood in a matter of seconds, as if every liquid drop had been replaced by the vital fluid of some cosmic sacrifice. The metallic, nauseating smell of fresh blood spread through the air, causing several people to instinctively recoil. The fish began to die immediately. Thousands floated to the surface, their silver scales grotesquely contrasting with the thick red that was now their liquid tomb. The Nile, source of all life in Egypt, had become a river of death. The waters that sustained an entire civilization now spread the unbearable stench of decay. The court magicians desperately tried to reproduce the phenomenon with their secret arts. They took some clean water from a jar and turned it into blood through their enchantments, but it was a pathetic trick compared to the magnitude of what they had witnessed. The entire sacred river, from its distant sources to its mouth in the sea, had turned into real blood. The impact was devastating and immediate. The Egyptians depended entirely on the Nile for everything: drinking, cooking, irrigating crops, feeding animals. Now they had to dig wells desperately along the banks, searching for underground water that had not yet been contaminated. Their hands bled as they dug into the hard earth, trying to find a few drops of clean water for their thirsty families. The irony was overwhelming. The river they worshipped as a deity had turned against them. Hapi, the god of the floods, seemed to have gone mad. Sobek, the crocodile god, saw his domain transformed into a scarlet nightmare. Khnum, the creator who supposedly controlled the waters of the Nile from the first cataract, proved powerless before the God of Israel. For 7 consecutive days, Egypt endured this unbearable reality. 7 days breathing the constant stench of aquatic death. 7 days watching their sacred sources become a constant reminder of mortality. 7 days realizing that their ancient gods could not restore even a single drop of clean water. I watched all of this with conflicting feelings that tore me apart inside. Part of me rejoiced in seeing divine power humiliate the oppressors of my people. Another part suffered witnessing the despair of innocent people. Egyptian children crying from thirst, mothers digging wells with their bare nails, the elderly fainting from dehydration. But it was only the beginning. This first demonstration established a pattern that would repeat. Each plague would strike directly at a specific Egyptian deity, revealing its impotence before the true sovereign of the universe. The blood in the Nile was not just a judgment. It was a declaration of war against the entire Egyptian pantheon. Pharaoh, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, kept his heart hardened. He saw it not as a sign to free the Hebrews, but as a personal challenge to his divine authority. Every drop of blood staining his sacred river only strengthened his determination to prove that the gods of Egypt were superior to the invisible god of the slaves. As the 7th day drew to an end and the waters remained red, a new tension filled the air. The Egyptians whispered among themselves about what else might happen. The Hebrews, protected in Goshen where their waters remained crystal clear, began to understand that their liberation would cost much more than they had imagined. The sepulchral silence that settled over the Nile Valley on that 7th night was not peace. It was merely the pause before the next storm approaching the contaminated waters. 7 days of blood had passed when the Nile finally returned to normal, but the false sense of relief that spread through Egypt lasted less than a single breath. Pharaoh's heart remained harder than granite, and the Almighty was only warming up for the display of power that would come next. The second encounter took place at the same sacred spot where the waters had turned to blood. This time, however, I knew I would witness something even more disturbing to the Egyptian mind. It would not just be the desecration of a natural element, it would be the complete invasion of their most intimate and sacred spaces by creatures they associated both with fertility and with repulsion. When I once again stretched the staff over the restored waters of the Nile, the response was immediate and deafening. The sound began as a distant murmur, then intensified until it became a deafening chorus echoing throughout the valley. Millions of frogs emerged simultaneously from the depths of the river, creating a cacophony that seemed to come from the underworld itself. It was not just a few hundred or thousands. It was an uncountable multitude that completely covered the surface of the Nile, turning the waters into a green, leaping mass that moved like a living, pulsing carpet. The sound of their croaking multiplied exponentially every second, creating such an intense noise that it was impossible to hold a normal conversation. But the true horror began when they left the water. The frogs did not remain on the banks as would be natural. They invaded in an organized and relentless way, marching in successive waves toward the cities, towns, and villages of all Egypt. It was as if they were receiving orders from an invisible general, moving with a defined purpose toward the places where they would cause the greatest disruption. They entered houses through the smallest gaps possible. They climbed walls, leapt through windows, slipped under doors. No physical barrier could stop them. The Egyptians ran desperately, trying to seal their homes, but for every opening they closed, the frogs found 10 other ways to get in. The invasion of the bedrooms was particularly traumatic. Entire families woke up in the middle of the night feeling something cold and wet jumping on their bodies. Children screamed in terror upon discovering frogs under their pillows, among their bedding, even inside their hair. Desperate parents tried to protect their children, but it was a lost battle against an amphibian army that seemed to multiply infinitely. The kitchens became impossible battlegrounds. Frogs jumped into boiling pots, contaminating food that had taken hours to prepare. They invaded lit ovens, creating a nauseating smell of burnt flesh mixed with the already unbearable stench of millions of amphibians scattered everywhere. Jars of water, baskets of grain, pots of oil. Nothing escaped contamination. The Egyptian temples, sacred places where the gods supposedly dwelled, were systematically desecrated. Frogs hopped over altars dedicated to Ra, defecated on statues of Isis, interrupted millennia-old rituals with their repulsive presence. The priests, guardians of religious purity, saw their sanctuaries turned into stinking swamps impossible to purify. The irony was devastating for a civilization obsessed with cleanliness and order. The Egyptians performed ritual baths multiple times a day, shaved body hair to maintain ceremonial purity, followed strict hygiene codes they considered divine commandments. Now they lived in a reality where it was impossible to take a step without stepping on a frog, impossible to eat without finding amphibians in the food, impossible to sleep without feeling slimy creatures jumping on their bodies. The court magicians tried to show that they too could summon frogs through their occult arts, but their pathetic display only added more creatures to the chaos already established. It was like trying to put out a forest fire with lit matches. They could imitate the phenomenon on a microscopic scale, but were powerless to control or reverse it. For the first time since the signs began, I witnessed something extraordinary. Pharaoh asked for my intercession. The man who considered himself the incarnate deity, direct descendant of Ra, begged me to pray to my God to remove that unbearable plague. He promised to free the Hebrews if I made the frogs disappear. I even granted him the privilege of choosing when the plague would end. He chose the next day, perhaps hoping I would fail and he could ridicule my power before the court. I prayed fervently, and at the exact hour I had promised, all the frogs died simultaneously. The silence that followed was almost deafening after days of incessant croaking, but instead of relief, it brought a new horror. Millions of frog corpses scattered throughout Egypt began to rot under the scorching sun. The stench of decomposition became so unbearable that people had to constantly cover their faces to breathe. The Egyptians piled the carcasses into huge mounds that looked like small mountains scattered across the landscape. The smell of death saturated the air so completely that it was impossible to escape it, even in the most ventilated areas. It was as if the entire country had turned into an open-air cemetery. But as soon as the air cleared and life returned to normal, Pharaoh's heart hardened again. The promise of freedom was forgotten as if it had never been spoken. The memory of humiliation faded before his restored pride, and he once again defied the power he had just witnessed. A dark lesson was beginning to take shape. Every demonstration of divine mercy would be interpreted as weakness. Every pause between judgments would be seen as an opportunity to resist even more stubbornly. The dust of the earth awaited its turn to testify against Pharaoh's obstinacy. The pattern was being established with surgical precision, cutting ever deeper into Egyptian pride. Blood had defiled their sacred river. Frogs had violated their most intimate spaces. And now the very dust of the earth, an element the Egyptians considered the source of their fertility and prosperity, would turn against them in an even more devastating way. There was no warning this time. I did not need to go to the palace or to the banks of the Nile for a dramatic confrontation. The third demonstration of divine power happened suddenly and inescapably, as if creation itself had received direct orders from the Creator to rebel against its oppressors. Aaron stretched out the staff and struck the dust of the earth with determined force. Immediately, every grain of sand, every particle of soil, every fragment of dry earth throughout Egypt instantly turned into lice. It was not a gradual infestation that allowed preparation or defense. It was a complete and simultaneous metamorphosis that turned the very ground into a sea of hungry, parasitic creatures. The lice appeared by the trillions, covering every available surface like a living, ravenous carpet. They jumped, crawled, and multiplied at a speed impossible for the eyes to follow. There was no escape because they literally came from beneath people's feet. Each step lifted clouds of parasites that immediately clung to the skin, hair, and clothing of every living creature within reach. The Egyptians ran desperately into their homes, only to find the interiors even more infested than the streets. The dust that had gathered in corners, in the cracks between stones, in the dirt floors, all had turned into a pulsating mass of microscopic, voracious insects. The torture was constant and inescapable. The lice pierced the skin with their tiny jaws, sucking blood and leaving red marks that itched uncontrollably. People scratched themselves until they bled, trying to relieve the torturous itching that spread over every inch of their bodies. Children cried day and night, unable to sleep because of the constant bites. The animals suffered just as much. Cattle, horses, goats, dogs. All domestic animals thrashed in constant agony, rolling on the ground in a futile attempt to rid themselves of the parasites that had become an inseparable part of their lives. Many weaker animals began to die from the combined effects of blood loss and exhaustion caused by relentless suffering. It was then that I witnessed something extraordinary and significant. The court magicians who had managed to imitate the first two signs with their occult arts were completely unable to reproduce this phenomenon. They tried desperately to use their enchantments, amulets, and secret rituals, but failed utterly. For the first time since the confrontations began, I heard a confession that echoed through the corridors of Egyptian power. The royal magicians themselves, custodians of the mysteries of their ancient gods, declared before Pharaoh that this was truly the work of God. They publicly admitted that they were facing a power that transcended any hidden knowledge they possessed. But Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, even before the testimony of his own spiritual advisors. If his most powerful magicians admitted defeat, if his gods showed absolute impotence, he simply ignored the evidence and clung even more stubbornly to his divine pride. The fourth plague brought a devastating escalation in Egyptian suffering, but also revealed something profoundly significant about divine protection. This time, for the first time since the judgments began, there would be a clear and visible separation between the territory inhabited by the children of Israel and the rest of Egypt. Swarms of flies descended upon the land like thick black clouds that partially blocked the sunlight. These were not ordinary flies, but voracious, aggressive creatures that attacked in organized formations. The collective buzzing of billions of insects created a deafening sound that seemed to rise from the abyss itself. These flies were not content just to annoy. They attacked fiercely, biting and stinging any exposed skin. They entered people's eyes, nostrils, and mouths, causing choking and panic. They contaminated all exposed food, making normal meals impossible. The air literally became unbreathable in many areas due to the density of the swarms. Entire houses became completely uninhabitable. The flies clustered in layers so thick on the walls that the very structure of the buildings was obscured. Egyptian families sought refuge in basements and cellars, yet they still could not fully escape the relentless aerial invasion. The geographic differentiation was impossible to ignore. While all of Egypt suffered under impenetrable clouds of voracious insects, the land of Goshen remained completely free from the plague. It was as if an invisible but absolute barrier protected the territory inhabited by the Hebrews. Desperate Egyptians tried to cross into Goshen, seeking refuge from the torment that had fallen on their lands. They discovered that the flies simply could not cross that spiritual boundary. It was a visual and undeniable demonstration that the God of the Hebrews not only had the power to judge, but also to protect selectively. This supernatural separation forced even the most skeptical to recognize that they were not dealing with natural phenomena or magic tricks. It was direct divine intervention that established sacred territory amid judgment. The invisible God of the slaves was showing absolute control over who would suffer and who would be spared. Pharaoh, pressured by courtiers who could no longer bear the situation, made another promise of liberation in exchange for the end of the plague. Once again I prayed, and the flies disappeared instantly throughout the whole extent of Egypt. Once again, as soon as relief came, the royal heart hardened and the promise was broken. A dark pattern solidified. Every display of divine mercy was interpreted as weakness. Every pause between judgments became an opportunity for greater rebellion. Pharaonic pride was not being broken by displays of power. It was being forged into an even more determined resistance. The next plagues would strike not only Egyptian comfort, but the very foundation of their economic and physical survival. The next attack would strike directly at the heart of Egypt's economy, destroying the source of its agricultural wealth and revealing the impotence of its protective gods of livestock. There would be no more demonstrations in public squares or dramatic confrontations on the banks of the Nile. This time, the divine hand would strike silently during the night, leaving as testimony only death scattered across the fields of all Egypt. The fifth plague came as an invisible pestilence that spread with the speed of the wind. At dawn, Egyptian shepherds went out to tend their flocks and found a scene of devastation they would never forget. Every animal, horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, lay dead in the fields, victims of a disease that left no visible marks but was absolutely lethal. Death had visited every farm, every stable, every pasture in Egypt during the night. It was not a gradual slaughter that allowed treatment or rescue. It was a complete and simultaneous extermination that struck all Egyptian domestic livestock at once. The sepulchral silence that fell over the fields, where once echoed mooing, neighing, and bleating, created a nightmare atmosphere that made even the bravest men tremble with fear. The economic ruin was instant and devastating. The herds represented not only a food source, but also a store of wealth, a means of transport, and agricultural labor. Entire families saw their livelihoods wiped out in a single night. Merchants who had accumulated fortunes through livestock woke up to absolute poverty. The foundation of all Egyptian agriculture, which depended on animals to plow, transport, and fertilize the land, simply disappeared. But the most striking aspect of this plague was not the destruction itself, but the supernatural protection extended over the herds of the children of Israel. While every Egyptian animal mysteriously died, every Hebrew sheep, goat, and ox remained perfectly healthy in the pastures of Goshen. The separation was so clear and absolute that even the most skeptical could not deny the divine intervention. Desperate Egyptians crossed into Goshen, hoping to buy animals from the Hebrews to rebuild their devastated herds. They discovered that the Israelites not only had healthy animals, but herds that seemed to have multiplied during the night of the pestilence. It was as if the same force that destroyed the Egyptian livestock had blessed and protected the Hebrew livestock. Pharaoh sent investigators to confirm whether indeed all Egyptian animals had died, while the Hebrews remained untouched. The report confirmed the impossible. Not a single Hebrew animal had been touched by the plague, while not a single Egyptian animal had survived. It was a display of selective power that defied any natural explanation. Even in the face of such overwhelming evidence, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. If his gods had failed to protect the sacred herds dedicated to them, if Apis, the sacred bull, had died along with all common cattle, If Hathor, the cow goddess, had shown absolute impotence, he simply ignored the signs and clung even more stubbornly to his divine pride. The sixth plague brought suffering directly to the bodies of the oppressors. There would no longer be any separation between those who commanded oppression and those who carried it out. This time, from Pharaoh himself to the last soldier who whipped Hebrew slaves, all would experience in their own flesh the pain they had inflicted for generations. I took ashes from the furnace, a symbol of the forced labor of the Hebrews who made bricks day and night for the pharaonic constructions, and threw it into the air before the royal palace. The ashes spread like a thin, invisible cloud that covered all of Egypt, carried by the wind to every corner of the proud nation. The effect was immediate and agonizing. Purulent ulcers began to break out on the skin of every Egyptian, from the most refined nobles to the humblest workers. These were not superficial wounds that could be easily treated. They were deep, painful boils that spread across the entire body, causing constant and unbearable pain. The ulcers did not discriminate by social status or wealth. They struck pharaohs and slaves with the same relentless intensity. Courtiers who lived in luxury writhed in pain just like common soldiers. Priests who performed purification rituals found their own bodies contaminated with sores that no incantation could heal. The irony was devastating for a civilization obsessed with bodily purity and physical perfection. The Egyptians considered any defect in the skin a sign of spiritual impurity. Now everyone bore visible marks that rendered them ritually impure according to their own religious laws. They could not participate in ceremonies, could not enter temples, could not even touch sacred objects. The court magicians, who had tried to compete with the first signs, were so severely stricken with ulcers that they could not even appear before Pharaoh. Their hands were covered with oozing sores that made it impossible to perform any ritual or enchantment. For the first time since the confrontations began, they were completely absent from the palace, incapacitated by their own physical condition. It was a complete humiliation of the intermediaries between the Egyptian gods and the people. If the very divine representatives could not protect themselves, what hope remained for common citizens? The absence of the magicians at this crucial moment sent a clear message. The gods of Egypt were powerless before the God of Israel. Physical suffering combined with psychological despair. People who had spent their whole lives trusting in the protection of their ancient gods discovered they were completely vulnerable. No amulet, ritual, or offering could relieve the pain that consumed their bodies day and night. But once again, the children of Israel remained completely protected. Not a single ulcer appeared on the skin of any Hebrew. They walked freely through Goshen with perfect, healthy skin, while any Egyptian who approached the borders bore the visible marks of divine judgment on their body. The distinction was so clear that it became impossible to deny the supernatural protection over the chosen people. Entire Egyptian families begged to be accepted as servants of the Hebrews, hoping that religious conversion might bring relief from their sores. They discovered that divine protection could not be bought or faked. It was a grace granted exclusively to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Pharaoh, even with his own body covered in painful ulcers, maintained his obstinate rebellion. Each wound throbbing on his royal skin should have been a reminder of the futility of resisting the Almighty, but it only served to harden his heart further, already petrified by pride. Two devastating plagues had simultaneously struck Egypt's economy and health. The herds were dead, the people suffered in constant agony, and still the pharaonic stubbornness remained unshaken. It was as if each display of divine power only served to strengthen his determination to resist to the death. The heavens began to prepare for even more terrifying demonstrations of the Creator's absolute control over his creation. The skies that had silently witnessed the destruction of the herds and the suffering of the ulcers were now preparing to become direct instruments of divine wrath. It would no longer be just the earth rebelling against its oppressors. The entire celestial creation would descend in fury to show who truly controlled the elements the Egyptians worshipped as gods. The seventh plague brought a storm that defied any natural phenomenon Egypt had ever witnessed. It was not simply heavy rain or strong wind. It was an apocalyptic display of power that turned the sky into a source of terror that made the earth tremble beneath their feet. I stretched out my staff toward the heavens, and the response was immediate and terrifying. Black clouds formed out of nowhere, swallowing the sunlight at an impossible speed. Within minutes, day turned into an artificial night charged with an electric energy that made the hair on our bodies stand on end instinctively. The air filled with a palpable tension that seemed to herald the end of the world. Then the hail began. But these were not ordinary hailstones falling from above. They were massive projectiles the size of clenched fists, some even larger, descending with destructive force capable of breaking bones and crushing skulls. The deafening noise of millions of hailstones striking the ground simultaneously created a sound as if the very heavens were collapsing upon Egypt. What made the storm even more terrifying was the fire that came down mixed with the ice. Constant lightning split the darkened sky, but instead of simply flashing and vanishing, they reached the ground as tongues of fire that spread and burned everything they touched. It was an impossible contradiction. Fire and ice falling simultaneously from the sky, destroying with opposing elements that collaborated in a dance of devastation. Centuries-old trees were shattered in minutes. Thick trunks that had resisted storms for decades broke like twigs under the relentless impact of the hailstones. Houses with thatched roofs caught fire instantly when the lightning struck them, creating blazes that spread even under the rain of ice. The crops that had survived the previous plagues were completely annihilated. Entire fields of wheat, barley, and flax, crops essential for Egyptian survival, were reduced to wreckage within hours. Every plant was cut to the root, every stalk shattered, every grain crushed into the ground soaked with vegetal blood. Men and animals caught outdoors during the storm suffered terrible injuries or died instantly. The hailstones were large and heavy enough to break bones and cause fatal trauma. Those who managed to find shelter in time watched through windows and cracks as the complete devastation consumed everything left outside. But again, the supernatural separation manifested itself unmistakably. While all of Egypt was battered by this apocalyptic storm, the land of Goshen remained under a clear and serene sky. It was literally possible to see where divine protection ended and judgment began, an invisible but absolute line that kept the Hebrew people completely safe while their neighbors suffered total devastation. Egyptians who managed to flee into Goshen during the storm discovered something extraordinary. At the exact moment they crossed the spiritual boundary, the hailstones simply stopped falling on them. It was as if an invisible dome protected that territory, creating a zone of absolute peace amid the destructive chaos consuming the rest of the nation. The storm lasted for hours, but when it finally ceased, it revealed an Egypt unrecognizable. Entire cities looked as though they had been bombarded by an invisible army. Fields that had once been lush now resembled battlefields, covered with plant debris and stained with the blood of animals and people who had not found shelter in time. For the first time since the plagues began, some Egyptian courtiers began openly questioning the wisdom of resisting the God of the Hebrews. They approached Pharaoh, begging him to allow the Israelites to leave before even worse plagues completely destroyed what remained of their civilization. But the royal heart remained petrified by pride. The eighth plague came like an organized army from the horizon. What began as a distant dark cloud revealed itself to be an invasion of locusts in proportions that defied human imagination. These were not local swarms that could be fought with fire or smoke. It was a coordinated migration of trillions of voracious insects that completely darkened the sky. The sound was deafening. The collective beating of trillions of wings created a constant buzz that could be heard miles away. It was as if the very air vibrated with the presence of this insatiable multitude approaching to devour everything left after the previous plagues. When the locusts landed, they literally covered every available surface. The ground disappeared beneath thick layers of insects that moved like a living, hungry carpet. Houses, trees, fences, everything was completely obscured by the mass of creatures piling atop one another in impossible density. The agricultural devastation was absolute and systematic. The locusts devoured everything that had grown after the hailstorm, but did not stop there. They ate even the newest sprouts trying to emerge from the devastated soil. They gnawed tree bark, dry leaves, every trace of plant matter they could find. Within days, they turned Egypt into a barren desert. Not even grass remained to feed the few animals that had survived the previous plagues. The landscape became brown and dead, as if years of drought had consumed all plant life in a single week of voracious destruction. The economic despair was total. There were no more harvests to feed the population, no forage to feed the remaining work animals, no plant raw materials for industries dependent on flax, papyrus, and other agricultural products. Egypt was literally starving. Once again, desperate courtiers begged Pharaoh to yield to the demand for liberation. Some openly questioned whether it was worth destroying the entire nation just to keep the Hebrews enslaved. But pharaonic pride proved stronger than any practical consideration. Pharaoh even summoned me and Aaron, offering partial freedom. The men could leave to worship, but the women and children had to remain as a guarantee of return. It was a desperate negotiation by someone beginning to realize he was losing an impossible war. But the divine demand was clear. The entire people must be set free, with no exceptions or conditions. When this demand was rejected, the locusts continued devouring even the last remnants of plant life trying to sprout from the devastated soil. Only when Pharaoh specifically begged for the removal of this plague, once again promising total liberation, did I pray for the locusts to be taken away. A powerful east wind rose instantly, carrying the entire swarm of insects to the Red Sea, where they drowned without leaving a trace. But as soon as relief came and the land breathed freely again, Pharaoh's heart hardened once more. The promise was broken like all the previous ones, and the royal stubbornness proved stronger than any devastation that could be inflicted on his nation. 8 devastating displays of divine power had reduced Egypt to a shadow of its former glory. But there still remained 2 final plagues that would strike not only the body and the economy, but the very soul of Egyptian civilization, plunging it into a darkness that would make all the previous plagues seem only rehearsals for the final act of this war between gods. 8 devastating displays of divine power had reduced Egypt to rubble, but Pharaoh's heart remained harder than granite. The moment had come to strike not only the body or the economy of the oppressors, but the very collective psyche of a civilization that worshipped light as the supreme deity. The 9th plague would be a direct assault against Ra, the sun god, revealing his absolute impotence before the creator of all the heavenly lights. I stretched out my staff toward the heavens for the second to last time, knowing that what was about to happen would plunge an entire nation into the most primal terror the human mind can experience. It would not be merely the absence of light. It would be the tangible presence of a darkness that could be touched, breathed, felt like a living substance that suffocated the soul. The transformation was instant and absolute. At midday, when the Egyptian sun shone in all its splendor at the highest point in the sky, a supernatural darkness descended over the whole land of Egypt like an impenetrable black curtain. It was not the gradual dimming of an eclipse or the natural arrival of night. It was the sudden and complete extinction of every form of light. This darkness transcended any natural phenomenon. It was dense, palpable, oppressive in a way that defied human understanding. Egyptians stretched their hands before their faces and could not even see their own fingers. It was as if a black, viscous substance had materialized in the air, enveloping each person in an individual prison of absolute darkness. The psychological terror was immediate and devastating. An entire civilization that based its religious identity on the worship of the sun discovered that its supreme deity had been completely nullified by a higher power. Ra, the creator of light, the father of all the Egyptian gods, displayed total impotence before the God of Israel. His golden rays, his vital blessings, his comforting presence, all had been swallowed by a darkness that even his most powerful priests could not explain or reverse. People stumbled constantly, completely losing spatial orientation in their own homes. Mothers could not find their children even when they were in the same room. Fathers desperately called out to their families, hearing answering voices but unable to locate where they came from. It was as if each person had been isolated in an individual bubble of impenetrable darkness. Panic spread like fire. Those who tried to light torches discovered that the flames simply could not penetrate the supernatural darkness. Candles were lit and produced heat, but their light was immediately swallowed by the darkness as if it had never existed. It was a darkness that devoured light itself, creating an impossible reality that broke every known physical law. For 3 consecutive days, Egypt remained submerged in this tangible darkness. 3 days without being able to perform any normal activity. 3 days of total paralysis for an entire civilization. 3 days proving that their solar deity was powerless before the true sovereign of the universe. Immobility was complete. Egyptians were literally trapped where they stood when the darkness descended, unable to move safely, due to the complete lack of visual orientation. Some tried to feel their way along walls but quickly lost their sense of direction, spinning in circles, unable to find even the doors of their own rooms. Psychological anguish intensified hour after hour. The darkness was not just visual, it was spiritual, creating an oppression that weighed on the soul like a gigantic stone. People reported sensations of suffocation, even while breathing normally, as if the darkness itself were consuming the air around them. But the most striking and humiliating aspect of this plague was the supernatural separation that once again manifested with absolute clarity. While all of Egypt was submerged in a darkness that could be felt, every dwelling of the children of Israel in Goshen shone with natural, clear light. It was not just that the Hebrews had light. They had the same daylight they had always known, as if the plague simply did not exist in their territory. Israelite families continued their normal activities. Children played under the sun. Farmers worked in the fields under a blue, clear sky that contrasted drastically with the absolute darkness surrounding their borders. Desperate Egyptians tried to crawl blindly toward Goshen, following rumors that there was light there. Those who managed to reach the borders of the Hebrew territory witnessed something that defied any rational explanation. A perfectly defined dividing line between darkness and light, between judgment and divine protection. It was possible for an Egyptian to stretch a hand across the invisible border and see it illuminated by the light bathing Goshen, while the rest of their body remained submerged in oppressive darkness. Some even tried to push only their heads through the spiritual barrier, experiencing instant relief from the psychological oppression, but discovering they could not stay there. They were gently but firmly pushed back into the darkness. During these 3 days of horror, I heard reports of Egyptians who temporarily lost their minds from the constant terror. The combination of absolute darkness, forced isolation, and spiritual humiliation broke minds unprepared to face the reality that their ancient gods were powerless. Some priests of Ra suffered mental collapse upon realizing that all their solar rituals, their morning prayers, their incantations dedicated to the sun, God could not produce even a faint ray of light. It was the end of an entire religious cosmology that had sustained Egyptian civilization for millennia. On the 3rd day, when the darkness finally lifted and natural light returned to Egypt, the relief was so intense that many Egyptians fell to their knees weeping simply because they could see again. But the psychological damage was done. Confidence in the supremacy of their gods was irreparably shaken. Pharaoh summoned me once more, his voice carrying an exhaustion he could no longer hide. He offered an even greater concession. All the people could leave to worship, but the herds must remain in Egypt as a guarantee of return. It was the most generous offer he had made so far, revealing how much those 3 days of darkness had affected even his seemingly unshakable resolve. But the divine demand remained absolute: complete liberation without conditions or guarantees. All the people, all the herds, all the possessions, everything had to be set free without restriction. When I rejected this final attempt at negotiation, something definitively changed in Pharaoh's expression. His final response echoed through the palace like a death sentence. Never again should I appear before him, for on the day he saw my face again, I would die. It was a desperate threat from someone who had lost all moral authority, but still clung to political power through intimidation. My reply was prophetic and grim. He was right. He would never see my face again. But before our last conversation ended, there would be one final plague that would make all the previous ones seem like gentle warnings. A plague that would strike every Egyptian household so devastatingly that Pharaoh himself would not only beg for our departure, but would drive us out of Egypt laden with gifts so that we might leave as quickly as possible. Midnight was approaching, and with it would come the final judgment that would forever seal the fate of two nations. The 10th plague would not be like the others. It would not strike crops, animals, or even the physical comfort of the Egyptians. This would be a sharp blade cutting directly into the heart of every family, taking what was most precious in their lives and leaving a void that could never be filled. It was the final judgment, the ultimate act of a spiritual war that would test the limits of human resistance against the divine will. Before the fatal midnight arrived, I had to prepare my own people for a ritual that would protect them from the destruction sweeping across Egypt. It was the institution of Passover, an eternal memorial that would forever seal in the collective memory of the children of Israel the terrible price of their liberation and the mercy that spared them from death. Each Hebrew family was to choose a perfect lamb without any defect and keep it for 4 days to observe its integrity. On the afternoon of the 14th day of the month at sunset, they were to sacrifice it and sprinkle its blood on the doorposts and lintels of their houses. It was a visible sign for the destroying angel who would pass through all of Egypt on that terrible night. The blood was not just a marker. It was a declaration of faith. Each family that obeyed this command was proclaiming its absolute trust in divine protection, even in the face of the death threat hanging over the entire land. It was an act of extraordinary courage to paint the doors with blood, knowing that death itself would walk the streets during the night. I watched my people carry out this ritual with a mixture of solemnity and sacred fear. Fathers explained to their small children why they were marking their houses with blood, trying to keep their voices steady while their hearts tightened at the thought of what would happen to the Egyptian neighbors they had known for decades. Mothers prepared the Passover meal with silent tears streaming down their faces, knowing that this would be a night that would forever change their lives. The lamb's meat had to be roasted whole and eaten with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. Nothing could be left until the next day. Everything had to be burned before dawn. It was a meal of urgency, eaten while standing, with belts fastened and sandals on their feet, ready to depart at any moment when the order of liberation finally came. While the Hebrew families prepared for the most important night of their history, a supernatural tension began to settle over all of Egypt. It was as if the very atmosphere thickened with the approach of final judgment. Animals grew restless without apparent reason, dogs howled incessantly, and a sense of dread weighed on every Egyptian heart. Midnight arrived with a sepulchral silence that seemed to suck all sound from the land. Then, in impossible and terrifying unison, began the wail that would echo across the whole of Egypt, like a deafening chorus of human despair. It was not a single cry or sob. It was a collective moan rising simultaneously from thousands of homes where death had entered like a silent thief. In every Egyptian house, from the royal palace to the humblest peasant hut, the firstborn male had died instantly. Age did not matter. Infants in cradles, playful children, young adults in their prime, mature men with family responsibilities. All the firstborn were touched by the invisible hand of death at the exact same moment. What made this tragedy even more devastating was its silent and inexplicable nature. There were no signs of violence, illness, or injury. The dead simply seemed to have fallen peacefully asleep, but no human power could awaken them. It was as if their souls had been summoned simultaneously to appear before the heavenly tribunal. In the royal palaces, Pharaoh's own son, heir to the throne, future ruler of the most powerful empire on earth, lay motionless in his golden bed. All the pomp and magnificence surrounding his life, all the grand plans for his future, all the refined education he had received, all became instantly irrelevant before the relentless reality of death. In the houses of the nobles, firstborn sons who had been raised with unimaginable luxuries and destined to hold positions of power, were found dead in their ornate chambers. Their mothers, accustomed to having every wish fulfilled by servants, now writhed in a pain that no wealth could soothe or remedy. In the humble homes of the workers, fathers who had placed all their future hopes in their eldest sons discovered that their dreams had died with them. They were simple men who worked from sunrise to sunset to support their families, and now they gazed upon the pale faces of those who represented the continuation of their bloodlines. The wailing that rose throughout Egypt was not only from grieving mothers and fathers. It was the cry of an entire civilization losing its next generation of leaders, warriors, priests, artisans, and farmers. It was the sound of a future being brutally torn away from the present, leaving only a deafening void where once there had been hope and continuity. In the prisons, firstborn sons serving sentences for various crimes were found dead in their cells. Death made no distinction between innocent and guilty, between virtuous and criminal. It was a judgment that transcended human rulings and struck solely based on birth order in each family. Even the firstborn animals died on that terrible night. Cattle, sheep, goats. All the first offspring of every species were struck by the same mysterious death that swept through human homes. It was as if all creation was paying the price for the stubbornness of one man who refused to acknowledge the sovereignty of the Creator. Throughout that entire night of horror, not a single Hebrew home was touched by death. The blood sprinkled on the doorposts had fulfilled its protective purpose completely. Hebrew families remained awake, listening to the cries echoing from the Egyptian territory, silently thanking God for the mercy that had spared them from the devastation consuming their neighbors. Some Hebrew mothers even wept for the Egyptian children they personally knew, children who had played with their own sons, young men who had grown up before their eyes. Divine protection did not diminish human compassion for those who suffered, even when they belonged to a people who had oppressed them for centuries. When dawn finally arrived, it revealed an unrecognizable Egypt. It was not just a mourning nation. It was a broken civilization that had lost its entire next generation of leadership in a single night. The silence that followed the early morning cries was even more disturbing than the screams of despair. Pharaoh, who had lost his own heir, sent urgent messengers to summon me to the palace. He was no longer the proud and defiant man I had faced for months. He was a shattered father, a broken king, a man who finally understood he had been fighting against a power infinitely greater than his own. His plea echoed through the palace halls with desperate urgency. "Leave immediately. Take everything that belongs to you. Take even our flocks as you demanded. But go before we all die." It was the complete surrender of someone who had learned too late that there are battles impossible to win. It was not merely permission to depart. It was an urgent expulsion. The same man who had refused to let even the men go for a 3-day worship in the desert now begged for the entire Hebrew people to leave Egypt as quickly as possible, carrying everything they wished to take. For the first time in 400 years of captivity, the children of Israel were no longer slaves. They were free men walking toward the promised land, carrying not only their belongings but the eternal memory of a liberation bought with tears of blood and forever sealing in human history the absolute power of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But our journey toward freedom was only beginning, and the same Pharaoh who had expelled us in desperation would soon change his mind once again. The dawn that followed the most terrible night in Egyptian history brought with it something no Hebrew had experienced in 400 years: true freedom. It was no longer a distant promise or an impossible dream whispered in slave quarters during nights of forced labor. It was a tangible reality, manifested in the desperate urgency with which the Egyptians themselves begged us to leave. The transformation was so sudden it felt surreal. The night before, we had been constantly watched slaves, forbidden even to dream of freedom. Now, the same guards who had whipped us for slowing our work escorted us respectfully to the borders of their cities, eager to see us leave as quickly as possible. News of the 10th plague had spread like fire across Egypt. Entire families who had lost their firstborn sons during the fatal night looked at us with a complex mixture of reverent fear and silent pleading. They knew we were the people of the God who had shown absolute power over life and death, and they feared that our staying could bring even greater destruction upon their devastated land. What struck me most was the forced generosity born out of Egyptian despair. Women who had always treated us as inferior property now approached offering their most precious jewelry, their gold and silver utensils, their finest clothes. It was not charity. It was a desperate tribute to hasten our departure and prevent the divine wrath from continuing to pour over their ruined nation. Hebrew families who had left their homes carrying only the essentials for the journey suddenly found themselves wealthy, bearing treasures they had never dreamed of possessing. Egyptian gold, refined silver, luxurious fabrics, precious stones, all the wealth accumulated through generations of slave labor was now spontaneously returned by trembling hands that only wanted to see us go. Hebrew children who had known only whips and humiliation now walked proudly beside their parents, wearing clothes once reserved for the Egyptian nobility. It was as if the entire social order had been reversed in a single night, turning the last into the first, and the oppressors into supplicants. The organization of our departure was miraculous in its efficiency. 600,000 adult men, accompanied by their wives and children, along with a mixed multitude of other peoples who joined us, formed a human procession stretching for miles across the Egyptian landscape. It was an entire nation on the move, carrying not only their belongings but the hope of 400 years finally coming to life. The herds we had managed to keep through the plagues walked with us, along with the animals the Egyptians desperately gave us to ensure our quick departure. Sheep, goats, cattle, a livestock wealth representing not only sustenance for the journey, but the economic foundation to rebuild our society in the Promised Land. We departed from Ramesses on a morning that seemed blessed by the very heavens. The sun shone with a golden intensity, illuminating our multitude as if we were a victorious army returning from a glorious conquest. And in a way, that was exactly what we were. We had won a war without swords, gained freedom without shedding Hebrew blood, and destroyed an empire through faith in divine promises. The silence accompanying our departure was eloquent. There were no wild shouts of joy or noisy celebrations. There was a deep solemnity, a collective recognition that we were living a moment that would echo through future generations. We were eyewitnesses to the fulfillment of promises made to Abraham centuries before we were born. As we walked, I looked at the faces of my people and saw in them a transformation that transcended the change of social status. They were the same men and women who had wept under oppression, but now they carried a dignity, born of knowing they were chosen by the most powerful God in the universe. They were no longer slaves. They were heirs to a heavenly inheritance. The children born in captivity asked constant questions about what it meant to be free, where we were going, about the stories they had heard whispered of a land flowing with milk and honey. It was moving to realize that an entire generation was discovering concepts like hope, future, and destiny for the first time in their lives. During our initial journey, many Egyptians accompanied us for stretches of the way, not because they wanted our company, but out of fear that our lingering presence might invite new plagues upon them. Some even suggested escorting us far beyond their borders to ensure we had no reason to return. The irony was inescapable. The same people who had built their wealth on our forced labor now offered valuable gifts to persuade us to leave. The same hands that had whipped us when we slowed our work now extended gold to speed our departure. It was divine justice manifesting itself in poetic and final form. We also carried with us the bones of Joseph, fulfilling an ancient promise he had extracted from our ancestors before dying in Egypt. It was a powerful symbol that our liberation was not only physical, but spiritual. We were reconnecting with our roots, honoring our history, and carrying our patriarchal identity toward the future awaiting us. The multitude following us included not only Hebrews, but a mixture of peoples who had witnessed the power of our God and decided to join us. Egyptians disillusioned with their own gods, slaves of other nations seizing the chance to escape, merchants seeing advantage in joining a clearly blessed people, all walked with us toward the unknown. Our initial route led us toward Succoth, deliberately avoiding the more direct path through the land of the Philistines. It was a divine strategic decision. Our people were not yet psychologically prepared to face immediate military conflict. Generations of slavery had created a mindset that needed to be gradually transformed into warrior courage. The landscape around us constantly changed, revealing an Egypt few of us had known beyond the forced labor zones. Sand, rocky hills. It was like discovering a new world that had always existed beyond the limits of our slavery. Each mile took us not only geographically but emotionally further from 400 years of bondage. When the sun began to set on our first day of freedom, we set up camp on a wide plain that could hold our immense multitude. Campfires dotted the landscape like earthly stars, each one representing a family sleeping free for the first time in generations. The sound of lively conversations, children's laughter, and songs of gratitude created a symphony of freedom that dramatically contrasted with the oppressive silence we had left behind. But even amid justified celebration, a shadow hovered over my mind. I had known the human heart long enough to know that regret could easily replace despair once the initial pain of loss faded. The same Pharaoh who had driven us out in terror might well reconsider his decision when he realized the immense economic loss our departure represented. As I watched our multitude prepare for the night, I knew our journey toward true freedom was only beginning. Behind us lay a broken but still powerful empire, led by a man whose stubbornness had cost dearly, and who might easily decide that the price of letting us go was too high to accept permanently. Ahead stretched an immense and merciless desert, where water was scarce and food non-existent. We would have to learn to trust in a provision that would descend from the heavens and spring forth from rocks. Further ahead still, a smoking mountain awaited us, where the very voice of the Almighty would thunder through clouds and lightning, engraving in stone the commandments that would govern our new society. But before we reached that sacred mountain, before we received the tablets of the law, before we tasted the heavenly bread that would sustain our journey, we would have to face one final demonstration of the power that had set us free. The waters would part like curtains to reveal a dry path through the impossible. Our freedom would be sealed forever, in the depths of a sea that would become a tomb. Only then, singing victory on the shores of ultimate redemption, would we truly begin our journey toward the promised land.